Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. And this is part 2 of our interview with Professor Ed Burton from the University of Virginia. And today we're going to be focusing on the economics and the underpinnings of this economic shutdown during the time of coronavirus. I have a special interest in this, and I've had an interest in business for many, many years. Most people know me from the radio. Some people know me from politics, but I have been a serial entrepreneur throughout my life, and it happened almost by accident. Going back to my days in college when I was playing a lot of music, I decided that I wanted to be in business for myself for a number of reasons, but if I was working for myself, I would have greater flexibility. And so by maybe the second year of college, a music friend and I, who was looking for the same things, started out a t-shirt printing business. Now, we were just brokering the shirts, but that expanded over the years into other products, and both of us went on to have our own businesses because at one point he said, "Hey, I don't want to be in business with you anymore," for whatever reasons he had. And I had to make the very difficult decision to either adapt or quit. And I kind of liked the freedom. In fact, I liked it a whole lot. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to establish myself here. And for 13 years, I held this business in Southern California out of a small office in the city where we lived called Sierra Madre, and really enjoyed having the freedom and also the economic prosperity. The harder I worked, the more money I would make, and I was able to live a fairly comfortable life in a non-traditional lifestyle. Over the many years that followed, and during that time, I held other jobs. They were almost exclusively part-time. I think there was a very, very brief time that I was a full-time employee of a Catholic school back in the 1990s, but it was a very short time. And outside of that, and even in that job, I've never been in a job that provided a health care benefit. So I've always been in a certain lane here to really understand what it's like to be an entrepreneur, what it's like to be in business for yourself, the joys and also the pitfalls of that lifestyle. So when we look around us today and we see businesses shutting down in the downtown mall, or those who are struggling to reopen getting hammered either socially or economically, there's a clear picture of economic devastation that most of us should be able to see. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that don't see that. They don't see it as a clear picture. They don't understand. And it all goes back to economic illiteracy. I use the word very, very definitively here because there are more and more, an increasing number of people in the United States who don't understand economics. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a couple of reasons. First of all, it's not being taught well, if at all, in the government schools, and that is intentional. You see, if you can keep people illiterate in the area of economics, they won't know what you're doing to them when you raise their taxes and take away their economic freedom. So that makes it easier for despotic politicians. But the other reason is the presentation of the material can be either dry or confusing. I remember taking an economics class when I was in what they used to call junior college, but city college back in Pasadena, California. And the teacher there was Tom Lance, a guy that I knew from a business that I used to work for, a men's big and tall clothing business. And Tom Lance would come into the store and order his clothes. He was a big guy. He's no longer with us, long gone. But Tom Lance decided he was going to teach economics, and he had a big kind of a seminar class. There was probably 50 to 70 students in the class, as I recall. And every day the subject was pizza and beers. And he tried to break economics down to pizza and beers, believing that college students could relate to that. Well, it was rather entertaining. And he went up and went on and on and on every single day in his monologue talking about pizza and beers. And I kind of got it, but I didn't really. I think he was trying, but he wasn't trying hard enough to make the subject graspable. Now, there are others who have done that. Thomas Sowell has done an excellent job in his writings, and there are several others who have made the subject graspable. But are those the people we're turning to? I think it was a few years ago they mandated some classes in government schools about basic economics. They realized this was a problem. I wouldn't be surprised at some point in the very near future, looking at who's governing the state, that those mandates are removed from government schools. But in the meantime, I believe they're still there. But what are they teaching? The false doctrine of Keynesian economics? That we would be able to just print our way out of our problems by printing more money? That big government leads to big prosperity? Those are all economic lies, and those are the lies that most high school students today are graduating with. Instead, we ought to be teaching people like Milton Friedman and those coming out of the Austrian school who are economic realists, who understand exactly how human nature plays into economics and why big government is not a friend of a prosperous economy. The problem today is many people, as they look to the downtown mall and they look across, they see shuttered stores and places that aren't reopening or are struggling to do so, is that many people don't know and understand the sacrifices of running a business. You know, when you work for somebody, I'm not saying you have no problems in your life or in your work life, because you do. But when you work for somebody, by and large, you get to leave those problems behind when you come home. You don't have to worry about paying the utility bills. You don't have to worry about, is the employee going to show up the next day? Did a shipment I was expecting not show up? Did I have an irate customer? You don't have to think about those things. But the person who owns the business, and in many cases the person who manages it, knows very well that these are difficult things. And so how do you ever know this? Well, basically you would know it if you did it yourself, like I did on a small scale, or through family or friends who are in such positions and you were empathetic towards them. Otherwise, you would really have no idea what these people are going through. And yet, if we look at the anguished cries of downtown business owners in recent stories, I've covered them on the radio, but they've been covered in the newspaper as well. Hey, how are we going to make it? Now, they got a bailout from the government, but that's not going to last forever. And they truly are anguished. They care for their employees, and I think primarily it's been extraordinarily painful because of the personal relationships that develop between the owner of a business and the people they hire, that having to say goodbye to employees or cut them way back has been a very difficult thing. But we should also ask, who are these business owners on the downtown mall? Well, I can't speak for all of them, and I do know there's at least one, if not two or three people who are more conservative in nature, but mostly they are millennials. Mostly they are likely political leftists who happen to have an entrepreneurial bent. But they don't understand the dichotomy between their embrace of leftism and the Democrat Party and their desire to be a successful entrepreneur. I've been contacted over the years many times, not only during my city council service, but also as a radio host, by people who are absolutely desperate. They're desperate because of the taxes being imposed upon them by local government, or maybe something from state government, or maybe it wasn't taxes at all, but regulation, but they're absolutely desperate and they're frightened to speak out. Will there be an awakening of the political leftists on the downtown mall in Charlottesville and across America when they see what happens when government not helps them, but crushes them? Yet these very same people over the years have continued to support policies and policymakers that lead to the situation we're in right now. And I think even here in Charlottesville, they still do that. If you were watching the news recently here in Charlottesville, you would have seen on Father's Day, leftist Marxists on the downtown mall screaming at people who were out dining in the open air because they wanted them to join their political cause. And so they thought a bullhorn and screaming and shaming would be a good way to get allies. In the meantime, the poor restaurant employees were subjected to this. The restaurant owners would see once again a huge drop in numbers, because who wants to go to the downtown mall when people are screaming at diners on what should have been a beautiful celebratory Father's Day afternoon? So what can we learn? Well, we can't print our way out of this problem, no matter what the government schools teach you in the Keynesian economics that most people seem to embrace in such a limited understanding. That's not going to happen, although we're trying it. The result's going to be bad. It's going to be inflation and probably something we haven't seen before. We certainly can't just pretend it didn't happen, because we're still living through it. And we know, even if we're not employed or partially employed, we know many people who are and who will not return to what they were doing previously. So the very first step is to understand our circumstances economically. Do we have a basic grasp of economics, the kind that underpins capitalism and also the kind that underpins socialism? Because we need to know the enemy as well. And do we have an understanding of the circumstances societally? How did we get here? Who is it in charge that's imposing all of this on us? And most importantly, how do we get out of the massive hole we've dug for ourselves? The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast continues with economics and Professor Ed Burton at the University of Virginia right after this.
Join the revolution. Online at shillingshow.com.
BorderHawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration, nationalism, and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.news. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Looking out for us. Rob Schaub.
And we welcome back to the program Professor Edwin T. Burton, PhD, University of Virginia Department of Economics. We're talking about COVID and all of the COVID lies that are being spread across the country. Today, I want to get to the topic of economics because that's your specialty. Thanks once again for joining us, Professor Burton. We're getting conflicting information here. The stock market is booming, and yet the U.S. economy is being hit with huge unemployment numbers. So what's really happening here, and what is going to be the impact down the line of all the money, the debt that was pumped into the system to kind of soften the blow?
Well, if you think about it, the stimulus package doesn't create resources or anything like that. In a world where you can't reopen your business, there's not any production. And reopening restaurants to 25% or 50% capacity doesn't create a whole lot of resources either. So what it does primarily is redistribute income. Those who receive the stimulus are effectively getting redistributed income from the rest of the economy. The impact on the economy is very different than it would normally be. Normally, if you have a recession and the Fed pumps money into the economy, there's some real output increase. That, certainly in May, was essentially forbidden by law. Mm-hmm. It was only as you got into May that there were any reopenings really taking place anywhere. And those reopenings were limited in character with all kind of additional social distancing restrictions, this and that. So the primary impact of a stimulus is very likely to be inflationary. And if you look at Federal Reserve data, it looks like most of the stimulus is still sitting in checking accounts, both corporate checking accounts and individual checking accounts. There's been spending, and no doubt spending jumped, but there's a huge amount of demand deposits in the system. And that's spilling out into home prices, stock prices, and so forth. So not only is the stock market strong, but look at the home price market. Look at the prices on residential homes, except in big cities, which have their own special problem. You go out to Albemarle County, or you go out to any other, suburb or rural area in this country, anywhere, you're going to find something of a housing price boom. Home prices are surging everywhere. That's inflation. That's what you would expect. And you would expect the same thing in the stock market. When you had the big inflation in the 70s, you saw surges in the stock market that followed monetary expansion, and then you would have fallback. So what the stock market is likely to do is go up and down, up and down, up and down. It'll go kind of roaring up when you have a stimulus, and then it'll sort of taper off when the stimulus kind of wears off. But it won't have a sense of direction. I wouldn't expect the stock market to be, way higher 3 years from now than it is now. But it'll certainly move around and act like it might go there. And home prices should continue to do well. In fact, all assets, real assets, should do well if we have inflation. That's what happened in the 70s. That was the great period for home price increases, the 70s. But it was a terrible period for the economy. Unemployment went from 3% to 11% by the end of the decade. Inflation went from 2% to 14%. So both unemployment and inflation rose throughout that decade. And I think that's a lot of what you're going to see here. So the stimuluses don't create any goods and services, but they create a lot of liquidity. And that liquidity is spilling into the stock market, and is spilling into the bond market as well, spilling into home prices. And you're already seeing it in consumer prices. If you're buying food at the grocery store, you already know that inflation is coming because you've seen it in your purchases. If you manage to get to a restaurant, you've already seen the increase in prices in restaurants. You're seeing car prices hold up much higher than they ever held up in a recession. So what's happening is you're seeing the inflationary pressures, and you're seeing them early. They won't show up in the BLS measurements of CPI and WPI for a while, but they will show up. And we're not too far down the road from when they will start showing up. Inflation is on the way, and that's going to be the next major economic problem. You're going to have a sluggish economy for years to come, and it's going to be having to contend with rising inflation. So that's ultimately the impact of the stimulus. The stimulus can't really take you back to where we were in February. There's no way it can. And as long as you have social distancing rules, it's not going to really matter that much. If everybody has to be 6 foot apart or 3 months apart, and you can only have 4 people on an elevator, and everybody has to wear masks, you'll never get this economy back to anything approaching full employment. You'll simply limp along in what used to be known as stagflation.
Yes.
And the best measure is to look back at the 70s and then just lower all the employment numbers a lot. You're going to have higher unemployment than you had in that decade, and you're going to have a lot higher inflation than you saw in that decade because the size of the stimulus is so big relative to the size of the economy. If you just look at the Federal Reserve balance sheet, and by the way, anybody who wants to pursue this, go to the website of the Federal Reserve. And all of this data is available. And you can see the tremendous expansion in demand deposits that are taking place. And in plain English, that's an expansion of the money supply. And when the money supply increases dramatically and there's no output increase, what happens? Prices go up. That's what happens. And you're seeing that in the stock market and so forth. So the stock market will just kind of bounce around. It'll have rallies and declines, but in general, it won't go anywhere.
So Ed,
all that's happening is inflation.
So Ed, what about the impact on interest rates? Because they have stayed so low in the midst of all of this, which is not historically the way things have gone. Why are the interest rates so low, and are they going to rise?
They're going to rise. By the time you get into October and November, you're going to see overnight rates one-day rates begin to start moving up. T-bill rates start moving up. And it'll be interesting when that happens, Rob, because most people feel like the Federal Reserve can keep that from happening, and they'll certainly try, but they won't really be able to. If inflation is moving up, the rates are going to go with it. And it's going to be interesting to see how the Fed defends rate increases in the middle of an economy that's flat on its back, which is where the economy will be in October and November. So you're going to have a strange pattern of rising rates when the economy is in very difficult straits. And the Fed will come up with some reason why that all makes sense. Who knows what it'll be. But the real truth is there's not much the Fed can do if inflation takes place. Rates are going to go up with or without the Federal Reserve.
Well, we've heard for years, Ed, that if interest rates went up, it would have a catastrophic effect on our debt payments at the state, local, and national levels. So what happens then?
Well, the administration the Trump administration has been lengthening the debt maturities. They've been selling a lot of 20-year bonds and 30-year bonds here to take advantage of the very low rates that extend out 20 and 30 years. So they're going to mitigate some of that. But to the extent you have a lot of financing in 3-month Treasury bills and 1-year bills and so forth, which you do, but I think the current number is about 20% of the debt's financed in that, and it could be different. I haven't looked at those numbers lately. But those rates are the ones that are going to move up. In other words, the short end rates are the first sign that they're going to go up. And by the way, other rates are not down. If you look at the rates for the corporations are using to borrow, or banks are lending to commercial lenders, those rates aren't down. They're, if anything, up. So the actual rates that people borrow at, no one's borrowing. Ordinary business doesn't borrow from the Federal Reserve. They borrow from a bank, or a corporation sells bonds. And if you look, for example, in the high yield debt market, those spreads are out. So financing is not cheap. And the banks have all tightened their lending standards. They're not doing any cash out refinancings at all. You're not going to be able to do cash out refinancing at your local bank anymore. And they've tightened all the lending standards, even for purchasing a new home. So it's really, well, the low rates are kind of a little bit misleading. If you go try to take advantage of the lower rates, you might find out that the rate for you, there is no rate because they're not willing to make that loan. But in any event, you're going to see rates start to go up, but not all rates are all that low. For example, the mortgage rates are around 3.25%, 3 3/8. I did a home refinancing in Charlottesville a little over a year and a half ago, and I did it at that rate. So what happened was, since then, rates went up and then they just came back down. Mortgage rates are about where they were a year and a half ago. They're not dramatically lower than that. You're not going to go get a mortgage at 2.5 or something. That's not going to happen.
Finally, Professor Ed Burton, as we look at everything we've talked about today, what are the lessons that we should take away from this? Because I'm fearful that we're not going to learn anything.
Well, I always think the best lesson, I think it was true in 2008, it's been true throughout all these periods, it's just let the markets work. And I don't think stimuluses are helpful. I think they make the ultimate recovery much harder to accomplish. And I think same thing happened in 2008. The TARP package and all the stuff that they did, bailing out the banks and all that kind of thing, those were counterproductive. They shouldn't have bailed out the banks. They shouldn't have bailed out anybody. They should have let the economy rebound, and it would have rebounded pretty quickly, as economies do when left to their own devices. As for the coronavirus, I guess my plea would be that when policymakers make decisions, they do them thoughtfully, and they do them based on science and health, as well as considerations for the economy. But what seemed to have gone wrong here is that most of the decisions made for America and for Europe and for even the state of Virginia were based on projections that were just wildly inaccurate. Absolutely wildly inaccurate. I mean, for example, the U.S. Decision to move forward by the Trump administration and start conducting these daily briefings were based on an estimate that came out of Imperial College that 2 million Americans would die from the virus. Well, only 500,000 people globally have died from the virus today, and yet they were projecting 4 times that number for the U.S. over a period of 6 weeks. It's a completely ridiculous projection, and it looked ridiculous at the time of it. And more knowledgeable epidemiologists from Stanford and other places countered that, but they weren't listened to. They turned out to be right, by the way, the Stanford guys who said, hey, wait a minute, that's not going to happen. But they listened to this Imperial thing. So did Boris Johnson in England. He listened to this guy, Imperial College. Just Google Imperial College and you'll see the ridiculous estimates that came out of these people. And here in Virginia, the policies are based on whoever projected 5,000 to 10,000 cases by mid-July. None of these projections ever materialized. All these scary projections. Instead of that, it might have been helpful just to look at the experience that, for example, the Asian nations had. They had been through the virus, so they had a lot of data and a lot of experience, and they were very successful. Very few people have died in Asia, China included, from the coronavirus. Far fewer have died in all of Asia than died in New York City. Far fewer. It's not even close. Why not look at the experiences of those countries like South Korea and Taiwan? South Korea is a modern country. It has a high population density, and particularly in Seoul. So there was a lot that could be learned. But instead of doing that, Governor Cuomo just kind of went off half-baked without really looking at anything, passed mandates forcing coronavirus cases into nursing homes. Can you imagine a worse policy than that?
No.
My plea would be, if you're going to really do something about these things, let's have a rational, logical plan. Instead of something that just is a virtue signaling kind of device. Let me just mention a current example of that. Many universities where students, 70 to 80% of them, live off grounds, are planning all these social distance measures and inline learning and this and that on grounds. So the 4 hours a day a student is on grounds, they will social distance. You and I both know what they're going to do off grounds.
Right.
And if you don't know, I invite anyone to go to University of Virginia off grounds housing, just cruise through there in the evening, and you'll see what they're doing. And they're going to do the same thing. So what good are you doing for the virus if 4 hours a day people are social distancing and 20 hours a day they're not? Far from it. They're, doing the exact opposite of social distancing. And who's kidding who here? Does this accomplish anything regarding the virus, or does this just provide a fig leaf for the universities? Are we seriously trying to do something about the virus, or are we trying to make, again, a policy statement or a political statement, or worrying about lawyers or anything else? Are we worried about health? And I think those are things that concern me as you look forward. What you want are solutions from government or policymakers that are designed to accomplish something, not designed to simply make a statement. And too much of what's happened the last 4 months is designed to make a statement, to show that we're all in this together. Well, we're not all in this together. Some businesses have been destroyed and other people have been unaffected. We're still paying the public school teachers. We're still paying professors. Their lives haven't changed much. But what's happened to the guy that owns the restaurant? He's done. This is a very uneven sledgehammer, and we are not all in this together. Some people are getting really damaged by the economic impacts, and some people so far haven't been affected really at all. So instead of making political statements, I think it would be better if serious policy decisions would be made. Somewhat like, Sweden may or may not have made the right policy decision, but they have gotten through this with a number of deaths per million that are not a whole lot different from our own in the U.S. And they were able to maintain freedom in their economy and freedom in their public schools, and people were still riding subways and so forth. There's a lot to be said for that. And they could be wrong. I'm not saying Sweden was exactly right, but their experience certainly is no worse than most European nations, and it's approximately ours. And yet they maintain the civil liberties of their citizens. They maintain the schooling of their children. These things are important. They're not to be just thrown out the window. So I would just hope in the future when these things come up, there's a more reflective look at the data, more reflective look at the economic implications of what happens. And when I say economic, if you look at the number of suicides in the U.S., the number of opioid deaths in the U.S., these shutdowns do kill people.
Yes.
And they're not painless. And those things need to be considered. And the future of our children needs to be considered. What's going to happen to these generations of children that are no longer really being educated? If anybody thinks online education works for a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old, they don't have any 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old. I've got here in my house right now a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And I can tell you that online education does not work for these kids. Then they need other kids. They need to grow up with other children. My 9-year-old grandson, he needs to see other 9-year-old grandsons. My 6-year-old grandson, he needs to see other 6-year-old grandsons. And before you just eliminate that just by fiat, the implications of all this need to be better thought out, I think.
Indeed, they do. Words of wisdom, Professor Edwin T. Burton at the University of Virginia.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Rob.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time,